Hey Hobby Game Dev, it's Chris Delian here with an answer to an extremely common question. It's a very important and pretty straightforward pattern to be applied every time this question comes up. But that grand question is, okay, I've heard great things about, you name the platform, Hax, Python, Allegro, SDL, Ogre, Unity, Unreal. It could be an engine, could be a programming language, could be a graphical input library like Allegro or DirectX or OpenGL or SDL with OpenGL and so on. And the question is, should I use it? You know, I want to make an RTS game. Should I use this platform? I want to make a first-person shooter. Should I try using Lua and Love 2D? And here's the simple answer to that question. If you can find a finished game that you like playing, that was developed originally in that language, or that platform, or that engine, or you name it, that was made in it originally, then you're in a good place, right? So if you can find a C++ based game that used SDL to originate an RTS style game, that's a good choice. If also, right, you got to keep in mind that they had similar constraints that you do. They were a small team or a team of one, that they had no budget or a really tiny budget, that they worked in a modest period of time. You know, did it take them 6 months? Did it take them 2 months? Did it take them 3 years? Because that's going to help give you some idea of how long it might take you to get to that level of kind of quality. There's a few caveats to this. Allow me to sort of draw them out, okay? Why do I say made originally in that platform? Well, because if it was just ported to that language from another one, watch out. Because the problem is, maybe it's not that good for iteration. Maybe the way that that programming language is structured, that platform is structured, the engine works, is that once things are hooked up a certain way, it's too hard to rearrange them, or it's too inconvenient to restructure them, too difficult to rethink and build, to think by building, as is really important when we're designing an original game. Anything can be ported to another language without being necessarily something that could have been designed in that language. Does that make sense? So just because someone's made a Minecraft port in that platform doesn't make it a good idea to work in that kind of platform for that style of game. Another example of why do I say a finished game? Because if it's not finished, you got to be suspicious about why isn't it finished and what about it isn't. You know, is it because the sound libraries aren't up to snuff? Is it because it's not ready to be deployed? It's not ready to be packaged and downloaded, or it needs too many other libraries that have to be downloaded with it? It needs a plugin that no one wants to install. Why is it not finished? The work that was done in that area. If it's a question of it's not genuinely fun to play, what do I really mean by that? What I mean is it's not sufficient for it to just resemble the kind of game you want to make. So it's important that it actually is something you get wound up and have fun playing. And not just that, okay, well, it looks kind of like, you know, a first-person navigational puzzle shooter, and that's what I'm going to make so I can use the same platform they did. Why do I say you've got to consider their team size and cost? This one's probably pretty obvious, but just because a team of 200 people over a period of 3 or 4 years were able to spend tens of millions of dollars, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars to make a great game with the Unreal Engine, doesn't mean that it's the best choice for you and your friends at a game jam to try to churn something out in 2 days. Or even you and some classmates in a few months. Maybe even you within a year. There's examples of people who can pull this off. Antichamber, I was going to say Hazard, formerly called Hazard. Antichamber, brilliant game by Alexander Bruce, and I love Alexander Bruce. But, you know, the thing took him years, and you can see that he had to be designed cleverly around the fact he's one person working in 3D space in the Unreal Engine, which fundamentally the Unreal Engine is the kind of engine that wants to have advanced graphical content. You know, that wants to have really high fidelity models and textures and so on, which as a small team, as an individual, it's just not the right environment to be pulling that off. You want to be playing it on the platform of choice. So, you know, so let's say I want to make a bullet hell kind of game, and I want to make it in SDL. I'm thinking about SDL. It's a graphics and sound library, uses C++, and so I find an example of it that plays in Windows. And I'm like, okay, well, this is cool because SDL also works in Linux, and I want to make a game to work in Linux, but there's a catch. Can you play that game that you found in Linux? And I say this because don't assume it's automatic that just because it supposedly supports another operating system, you can trivially port the work you do in one to the other. Sometimes they rely upon libraries or DLLs or externalities that are out of your control, that actually prevents you from making that port or prevent that port from being successful in the least. So I had a problem many years ago. It was actually a first Game Creation Society project that was completed. Dragon and Xie Lang, it's a little RPG style thing. It was a basic scripting engine and whatever. We used Allegro, and we were like, okay, well, Allegro's cross-platform, and it supports C, and it's a good kind of way for us to do this. We wrote the game for Windows, tested in Windows, played in Windows. We had a friend who was going to port it to Mac just to make sure everything worked fine, and he just couldn't get the text engine working. So we couldn't load fonts. And without the text engine working, we couldn't have our dialog boxes. And in an RPG, you have to have dialog boxes, right? And so we couldn't fundamentally port it. We couldn't have expected that just because we made the game work for Windows in a language and platform that theoretically are cross-platform, it wasn't going to work in Mac for us. So you got to make sure you can actually play it and test it in the environment you think you can. There's something to be said for people who lead the pack. And GDC, they used to give out this award called the First Penguin Award. And that's someone who dove into the water, took a big risk that later others followed. And it has to do apparently with penguins out on the ice where, they're waddling along. And one of them has to be the first one to jump in to see if a seal eats them. And if they don't get eaten, then the others can follow suit. And that's a worthwhile award. It used to be when they gave it. Anytime a new platform comes out, there are financial incentives to being early to that platform. I was an early release on iPad. I was an early release on the iPhone App Store. Those are financially beneficial to me. But, important caveat here. I'd been making video games for 10 years prior to that. Those were not my first projects. That was not my way of trying to get my feet, wading into the water, of trying out game development. That's a fairly advanced thing to be doing, to be spelunking in the dark, trying to figure out, is this platform viable for what we're trying to do? That's a weirdly difficult technical and design challenge, as opposed to if you're just getting started out, you need to know what you're trying to do is at least possible, so that if it's failing on you, you know it's because of something you need to learn, and not because of a fundamental issue of you just picked the wrong language, you've just picked the wrong platform. And so if you can't find a game that's playable, that's fun, that's finished, that works on the platform that you're trying to target, that runs at an acceptable frame rate, you got to start wondering why. Maybe it's too hard to distribute, maybe it's too hard to iterate in, maybe it's too slow, maybe it doesn't support the kind of input you need, maybe it doesn't work in browser and you need something that works in browser. Whatever it is, be suspicious if you can't find at least one example that roughly indicates that you're in the right space, especially if it's been out for years, right, and no one's ever, for whatever reason, at your scale been able to make a game of that sort. If you're starting out, if you're even intermediate level, be skeptical of that, be wary of it. And pick yourself another platform. People get too stuck in whatever language they learned first. No matter what language it is. And a lot of folks, it's Java because that's what I learned first in computer science classes. Here's the story. Java's an awful language for making video games for the most part. There's a few exceptions. RuneScape is brilliant. RuneScape and Minecraft. Absolutely brilliant games. Work in Java. I've seen a few other games, very few other games, playable, complete, decent fun, work out in Java. Vectorverse was a VGDev game that came out well in Java. But the reality is, for the most part, it's not a good language for developing games for a myriad of reasons in terms of difficulty of distribution, in terms of versioning issues, you name it. Performance being a big one. And so because of that, people feel stuck to it. When the reality is, C and C++ are actually quite a bit like it. ActionScript 3 is quite a bit like it. No matter what language you've already worked in before, even if it was something like GameMaker with scripting, you could make the jump more easily than you expect to another language or another platform or another engine. Because oftentimes, a lot of the differences are semantic. We hear the word languages, we can get intimidated by it because it's like, well, if I spent all these years learning Italian and now I'm going to try to learn Russian, or I spent all these years learning Japanese and I'm going to try to learn German. You're starting from scratch, right? Whole different grammar, whole different vocabulary, tons of exceptions to memorize and practice and be fluent in. But human languages are very different than programming languages. Programming languages have a vocabulary in the dozens of words, and realistically speaking, you're only using half a dozen to a dozen of those really, really frequently. Programming languages have excruciatingly, frustratingly perfect grammar with no exceptions, right? I mean, the compiler has to eat through it, so it's extremely axiomatic of what structure is correct and where you put semicolons or braces or spaces or tabs, or depending on the language. It's oftentimes a difference of how you declare variables, of how you call functions, of how you write a loop, of how you command flow of code, but it's usually the same concepts. It's usually this, the same algorithm thinking is going to apply, the same processes are going to apply. It just becomes down to how would I do here what I knew in some other language. And to be fair, there are worthwhile, meaningful differences in languages in terms of their ease of, say, writing cross-platform or network or high-performance code or low-level code or special hooks into different types of input, or whatever the case might be. And those can be learned on sort of an isolated case to make the most out of language, but especially if you're a hobbyist, if you're a small team of students, if you're just doing something on the side to learn, to get experience and practice, you can really write a lot of it the same way you'd write in some other language. You just learn to kind of translate that in your mind as you go to, okay, well, for this language, I say var space something colon before I do this other thing. A signal of this, right, is Unity scripting engine. Supports JavaScript, C#, Boo, maybe even another one at this point. But it's really fundamentally restructuring all those into the same thing, because they are all the same thing in the case of Unity. It's just different semantics. Don't be intimidated away from learning another platform. Oftentimes, it's really what you need to do to help your game reach more people. Game Creation Society back in early 2000s. We were writing games, mid 2000s, I guess. We were writing games mostly in C++ and C that were downloadable. We used Allegro and SDL and OpenGL and DirectX and whatever, a couple C# projects in there. And those were hard for people to play because they had to download and install them and configure them and so on. They'd run into driver issues or incompatibilities, or especially as operating systems changed and upgraded. For VGDev, which we started in maybe almost 10 years later, 8, 9, 10 years later, we used mostly ActionScript 3 at first, and we gradiated largely towards Unity. But in both cases, because we have an easier time reaching people with our games, but we've been flexible to the fact that here's the languages that right now will reach more people, that are easier for us to use, and that we could find examples, proven examples, on Kongregate and elsewhere on the web that high-performance, decent, playable, good-looking games could be produced by people with our kind of means, at our kind of scope, at our kind of scale, using these platforms. And so that's what we did. So to go back to the original question, I've heard great things about Hacks. I've heard great things about Pygame. I've heard great things about Unreal, whatever the case might be. The answer to whether or not you should be using that is, can you find a finished, fun, playable example of a game that works on your target platform, developed by somebody with your kind of resources? And if not, find an example that was, no matter what the platform, figure out what it was made in, and consider that maybe that's a better starting point for where you're at. So it's Chris Stein for Hobby Game Dev. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you've got questions, by all means let me know by email, or of course you can always comment down below, and I'll try to follow up on that. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.